Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome the audience to this Linguists Online Conference with the illustrious Dr. Ira Noveck. On behalf of Abralin, I have the honor to moderate his talk. Abralin ao Vivo Linguists Online is an initiative of Abralin, Brazilian Linguistic Association, in cooperation with many international associations, including the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, the Associação de Linguística e Filologia de América Latina, the Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, among others. So, on behalf of Abralin, again, I'm going to give Dr. Noveck's biodata. Dr. Noveck is well known in the area of experimental psychology. He has received his PhD in experimental psychology from New York University with a focus on logical inference and reasoning. Over the course of several postdocs in the US, Canada, and France, and a professorship in Grenoble, his research led him to take seriously the proposition that a participant's approach to a reasoning problem critically depends on the way the reasoner interprets rules and instructions. That is, linguistic considerations, and especially semantics and pragmatics, ought to be incorporated when analyzing the outcomes of reasoning and comprehension experiments. This prompted a research program known as Experimental Pragmatics. Dr. Noveck spent the next 20 years, starting in 2000, as a full-time CNRS researcher at the Institut des Sciences Cognitives Marc Généraux in Lyon, including 5 years as one of the Institute's directors, when he pursued experimental pragmatics research while also providing institutional infrastructure to this evolving discipline. In January 2020, he joined the Laboratoire de Linguistique Formelle in Paris under the auspices of the CNRS and the Université de Paris. So, again, I have the honor to moderate Dr. Noveck, and let us welcome him to this talk.
Well, thank you for that, Christina. I want to thank you for moderating this, and also I want to thank Miguel Oliveira and Abralin for inviting me. So thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this series. As Christina mentioned, I'm an experimental psychologist by training. I studied reasoning, which means I was interested in the way people solve reasoning problems, but also the way people would interpret, say, connectives like if and or, quantifiers, etc., and they became very important. And so there's a bit of a transition, and with that in mind, I just want to thank some people who were critical to that transition, namely Guy Polizia, Dan Sperber, and Deirdre Wilson. They've encouraged, inspired, often co-authored, and often critiqued some of the research that I have carried out. This series has covered everything about language, phonology, syntax, segmentation of speech, semantics, lexical semantics, and so on. But ultimately, a spoken sentence, an utterance, needs to be understood by the addressee, so that once the signal gets through, it'll ideally be understood as intended by that speaker. Now, how does that work? Especially when the words in an utterance do not provide all the information that is needed to actually understand what the speaker means to convey. Paul Grice was a philosopher who underlined how sentences get us only so far in understanding a speaker. He essentially laid out the groundwork for most of the modern work on pragmatics in showing how we infer meaning from sentences and context through inference. And what I'm going to do today is take some of his notable examples that he used to demonstrate how we go above and beyond what the words in the sentence say to actually understand the intention behind a spoken utterance. So the first one is, he's a fine friend, which was, imagined to be said after the friend betrayed a secret. So that's actually being ironic, right? So that's an ironic utterance that's being said, and we'll see how people process that. Another example that he gave is X is meeting a woman this evening. The choice of a word like woman seems kind of particular, which can lead the listener to assume that it's a woman other than somebody close to X, like his wife or girlfriend or mother or sister or a friend that could be mentioned by name. And finally, the third one is actually a bit of it's not exactly how he formulated the sentence, but if someone were to say Bill is a philosopher and he is therefore brave, that is a expression that actually has two conjuncts, right? It's a conjunction between Bill is the philosopher and Bill is brave. And the word therefore links them together in a way to suggest that being one causes the other, or has some kind of implication for being part of the other. So that third one is what he would call a conventional implicature, because the word therefore is adding some kind of pragmatic input, and it's part of conventional part of language. So ultimately, our goal is to try to understand how do utterances provide meaning, right? And when I've given lots of talks about Gricean approach to utterance understanding, and I'd say most language researchers generally know that Grice made a distinction between what a sentence means. A sentence can be analyzed for its grammatical and phonological, I'd add, semantic properties, and the intended meaning of that sentence when it's used as when it's used as an utterance. So that is, I think, intuitively clear. And he's also known for having introduced the cooperative principle and his maxims. So, generally he's saying we expect each other to be cooperative when engaging in conversation and to follow certain norms. And those became important. Here, I just the other day I uploaded Grice's maxims, and there are tons of examples that people have used for slides. I just pulled out one, and which I think captures well the idea is that people observe, say, these four maxims. One of quality, which is to be truthful. You could detect if someone is not being truthful. Quantity is not to say too much or too little. Relations to be relevant. Manner tells you to be clear and brief and orderly, to avoid ambiguity, etc. And the idea is to exploit these maxims, or to watch out, to be aware of these maxims as you process an utterance, and ultimately it can lead you to the speaker's intended meaning. So to take that first example I gave, if you take Grice's traditional approach, if someone tells you, a friend of yours tells you, oh, he's a fine friend, after that friend betrayed a secret, well, he would divide it up into what is said. John is a fine friend. And then that is blatantly violating the first maximum of quality. Do not say what you believe to be false. And then it leads to an implication, what would be called an implicature, and that would be John is not a fine friend. But what a lot of my interlocutors, or people, the new friends I've made in linguistics, often overlook is that his proposal was really designed to highlight the role of intentions. And so by doing that, he was moving away from what is essentially the code model, right? So a code model is the idea that, you say a set of words, you say a sentence, it is cold, it goes out into a medium, that's how it gets coded into language. It goes over a medium, and then it gets decoded by the listener, and that listener can make reference, say, to the words and understand what the speaker had in mind. And implicit in this view is the notion that the message contains everything that the listener needs in order to understand the speaker's transmission. All the listener needs to do is capture the utterance, decode it, unpack it, and there's not much else. Now, Grice's proposal, which is based on the listener making an approximation of a speaker's intention based on presented evidence, represented a radical shift from this vision and points in the new direction for theories of communication. So, from his point of view, the same little exchange where a friend comes in and says it is cold, the listener could say, okay, she wants me to understand that it is cold. That's one possibility. That's cold, let's say, outside. But actually, recently we've been talking about how it'd be nice to use the fireplace when it's cold outside. So perhaps that's a indirect request that I light up the fireplace. So it's a different way of looking at the way communication works. So today, what I'd like to do is describe in slightly greater detail how Grice and others, because I'm going to also be talking about relevance theory quite a bit, view intentions with respect to utterance understanding. I'm going to describe how experiments, I'm an experimental psychologist, I can't get away from that, have been critical for advancing these Grice-inspired approaches, and ultimately argue that intention reading is indispensable for utterance comprehension. Now, to elucidate Grice's approach, let me begin with a little true story, it's a story I like to tell because it captures a lot about the role of intentions in communication. And if you have been at one of my talks, or if you've read about this in my book, forgive me, but I think it captures well what Grice had in mind. As Christina described, I've traveled a bit and I've moved to France, and my French, though, is okay right now. It's pretty good, I guess. But when I first moved to France, it wasn't that good. And during one of my stays, I worked hard on my French, and I would go almost every day for a goûter, like a good French person. Around 4 o'clock, I go out, go get my snack. And I remember walking to, kind of a very nice pâtisserie, not too far from where I was living. And I said in my best friend's French, est-ce que je peux avoir une tarte aux fraises? Something like that. And, rather than react to what I said, the serveuse, the person waiting on me, basically folded her arms and said something that I didn't quite understand, which in my mind sounded like blah, 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 blah. And I thought, okay, my French isn't clear to her, so I guess I'm gonna have to try again. And so now I came up with a second formulation, something like, puis-je, honestly, I don't remember exactly what I did, but I do remember changing my sentence, thinking that maybe this time it'll get through. And I pointed to my tarte aux fraises and I said, puis-je avoir une tarte aux fraises? And I had the same reaction. She kept her arms folded and said something that I just did not understand. And now I was thinking, okay, maybe these are reserved, or they're fake, or they're not for me in any case. I should just think about something else. But I thought I would give it a third try, and I said a third formulation, s'il vous plaît, donnez-moi. I honestly don't remember, but I just remember trying my best. And this time she reacted, and I remember she pointed, and because what she was actually telling me was, don't touch the glass showcase, right? So she was telling me something that I was not expecting at all. And that stayed with me. To be honest, I wasn't, full-on Gricean back then, but that story remained with me. And as I became more attached to a Gricean approach to language, that story I thought was very elucidating. Why? Well, a couple of things about it that were interesting. One is that it was really important for her to get through to me, right? I mean, it would have been easier for her to just pack up a strawberry tart, put it in a package, let me go. I would have made fewer fingerprints that way. But it was important for her to get not only her message across, but that I should get her message across. And that's exactly what's part of the Gricean program, that according to Grice, there are actually three levels, three kinds of intentions that are important. But I'm going to focus on two today, partly because relevance theory just thinks we only need those two, but I'll go through all three. So, and also rename them to make them a bit more user-friendly. So, one intention is what I'll call the what intention, which is the proposition she meant to convey. In this case, it was essentially, to paraphrase, get your bloody fingers off of my glass showcase. The other more subtle intention, this is the one that kept her with her arms folded and refusing to move, it's crucial too, which can be loosely described as, I want you to recognize my intention that I want you to take your fingers off my glass showcase. So to put it in Gricean, plain language, but in Gricean language, the speaker intends to change something in the addressee's mental states. That's, what the speaker wants to convey. And the other one is, well, the address, in order for that message to come across, the addressee has to recognize that the speaker has an intention to change his mental state. So there has to be, a recognition on the part of the listener that's going to happen. And it wasn't until I was able to recognize her that intention, that I was able to understand what she was trying to come across. And I also point out that her finger pointing was really critical. She made a gesture that completely changed my way of thinking about what she was trying to tell me, and that kind of opened up all the rest. Right? I was able to parse what she was saying. I was able to get at what she was saying. I appreciate her informative intention. Right? So that's the language from relevance theory. There's an informative intention, which is that what intention, and then there's a communicative intention. Now, just to complete the story, I don't want to dwell on it for too much, but Grice argued that there is a third intention which completes the previous two. That is what he called I should describe. For Grice, these are examples of non-natural meaning. He was contrasting natural meaning, which are things that we see, the kind of, say, interpretations we make every day. If you see smoke, it naturally means fire. If you see spots on somebody's skin, it could, naturally means they have measles. So when he was talking about utterance interpretation, he was calling that non-natural meaning. And he said that non-natural meaning is completed when the hearer fulfills the first, what I call the what intention, based on recognizing the speaker's that intention. And as Scott Phillips wrote, this final intention is crucial. He wrote in a really nice book, it is the heart of Grice's account of meaning. To mean something should intend that my audience believes it, and they should believe it at least in part because they recognize that this was my very intention. So this is the meaning of Gricean non-natural meaning. Okay. So now the question is, how do these steps impact on utterance comprehension? Well, the main point is that, figuring out the speaker's intended meaning is going to depend, certainly to some extent on language, but not exclusively. The process from an utterance to speaker meaning is going to depend on a form of hypothesis testing or abduction to the speaker's informative intention. Okay, well, I've laid the kind of theoretical groundwork that drives a lot of the experiments that we do. And so let me just give you some examples. I'm actually going to take those three examples I presented up top, one on irony, one on an under-informative statement, and a third that he would call a conventional implicature, and show how we've investigated them in the laboratory. Well, okay, irony is classically defined to be to say the opposite of what one means. And as I showed earlier, you could go through the three steps and set up what some people call kind of negatively, derisively, as the standard pragmatic model, where you take Grice's traditional approach, you put it into his sort of mechanically put it into his formula, and you come out from he's a fine friend to what is implicated, or an implicature to John is not a fine friend. But in a way, what's happening is that you're taking that classically defined account for what irony is and turning it into an implicature. And early on, the psycholinguistic literature on irony quickly focused on Grice's derivation and about the way irony-laden sentences should be processed. Or the speed at which those sentences should be processed. So let me just give you, I'll give you the outline of a kind of story we would present, but I'm going to get into it in greater detail. But this is just to put you in the mood of how we go about doing this. So, imagine two opera singers who perform in the same production of Carmen. Everything works out as planned. And then one of the singers says to the other, tonight we gave a superb performance. Nothing remarkable here. She's making a statement that follows from the context. But now imagine that things didn't work out. They sang off key, they forgot their lines. And now she says the exact same thing. Tonight we gave a superb performance. I'm trying to keep the prosody constant, but in any case, all these stories are typically read, so prosody is not built in. These kinds of stories would be used to, make claims to, well, is irony effortful? Why is that relevant? Well, if you're going to be a Gricean and you're going to apply the standard pragmatic model, the steps you have to go through to go from he's a fine friend or from we gave a superb performance to understanding something that's the opposite or an implicature, you're going to be doing extra work compared to that literal reading, right? So if you're comparing that literal sincere statement, we gave a superb performance, to that very same statement when it's ironic, you should expect the irony to be more effortful because you had to go through extra steps. And indeed, some folks do find that longer reading times for a sentence, as from Schwabel et al., longer latencies for ironic readings over literal readings in an eye movement study. So there's some evidence for that. But then, of course, and this is a common theme in any research project, but people try to test it, with sometimes the hope of undermining these claims. And sure enough, there are people who claim that irony is not effortful. Gibbs led the way in making those claims, finding at times equivalent reading times for a sentence that has an ironic reading as opposed to a literal reading. I have some issues with that particular study, but in any case, you can get people to modulate the processing of irony with certain features in the context that might make it as fast or closer to a literal reading of that sentence. But what's important to me for today is to point out that this debate, has pushed a major feature of irony into the background, and that's the role of attitude description. When people in the pragmatic literature talk about irony, the focus isn't on the standard pragmatic model or the steps that you have to take necessarily, but on the way that when you say something ironic, you're actually expressing an attitude. So, to make this clear, one post-Gricean theory that highlights intention in general and where it's manifest in irony comes from the originators of relevance theory, Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson. And they propose that the speaker, when speaking ironically, expresses a derogatory attitude to a meaning that he or she merely mentions. Right. So the idea is that when you make an ironic remark, you're actually referring back to something that that was either previously mentioned, might even be part of like standard norms, like you would expect an opera performance to go well. And if you make a remark that is referring to that, you're echoing what was expected, but you're doing it at the same time as you're expressing some kind of derogatory attitude. To make this even clearer, I like this this one example from paper 92. Imagine Mary after a difficult meeting says, that went well. Now, Mary might use that went well to communicate that it was ridiculous of her to think that the meeting would go well. stupid of her friends to assure her that it would go well, naive of her to believe their assurances, and so on. So Mary echoes a thought or utterance with a similar content to the one expressed in her utterance in order to express a critical or mocking attitude to it. And in fact, Grice is not the Sperber and Wilson aren't the only ones who made reference to the role of a dissociative attitude, the role of attitude when you process irony. Even, Grice, even though people referred to his standard pragmatic model, he recognized that part of irony was a hostile or derogatory judgment or a feeling such as indignation or contempt. And another post-Gricean theory from Herb Clark and Richard Gehrig highlights pretense, they call it pretense theory. And they argue that a speaker of an ironical utterance is not herself performing a speech act, making an assertion or asking a question, but pretending to perform one in order to convey a mocking, skeptical, or contemptuous attitude. So if you walk into a rainstorm, you go, "Oh, what beautiful weather," you're kind of pretending to be a weatherman, announcing beautiful weather, but you're doing it with an attitude. So there's a gap between theories of pragmatics and the psycholinguistic debate. The theoretical debate is concerned about the way people arrive at an understanding of the speaker's attitude. And then there's that psycholinguistics debate, which is concerned about the surface features of the words used in irony and their effect on processing speed. And a lot of this grew out of rejecting that standard pragmatic model, where you consider the literal meaning, you find a violation, and then you come up with an implicature. Well, okay, let me tell you about how we went about this. So Nicola Sportorno, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania doing, he moved into fMRI research. He and I embarked on a series of studies using a variety of techniques that aim to show that the data on slowdowns linked to irony processing are due to an interaction between language processing and theory of mind processing. And when I say theory of mind, I'll describe that in some detail in a minute. But the idea is that getting at the speaker's attitude is going to be part of the theory of mind in this case. And one of the studies that we did, we used fMRI because there's a rich literature on capturing areas that are known to be involved in theory of mind processing. But before I get to that, let me just point out that no prior fMRI study had extensively investigated the link between language processing and theory of mind, right? So there's people who focus on language, and there are people who focus on theory of mind. But based on what I've been arguing, we thought it would be eminently sensible to find neurological evidence that directly links a specific linguistic phenomenon, irony, and theory of mind processing. Okay, so I mentioned theory of mind, and I think that this is important because from my experience when I talk to linguistic audiences, it tends to be overlooked. But what is the theory of mind, and what's the theory of mind literature? Theory of mind is about the way we, essentially do mind reading, right? So how you detect what a speaker might think or feel, or, I'll stick with the cognitive theory of mind, what people might be thinking, etc. And almost all the work came out of some clever developmental tasks. I'll show you the Sally Ann task. In the Sally Ann task, there are two girls, one Sally and one Ann, and they're in the same room. And so here's Sally, here's Ann. Let me put on my laser pointer. And Sally puts her ball in a basket, and she walks out of the room. She goes away. While she's away, Ann takes the ball and puts it into her box, and she goes away, and Sally comes back to look for her ball. And the question that's asked of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and so on is, where will Sally look for her ball? And 3-year-olds typically say that they'll look inside the box, that Sally will look inside the box, but Sally doesn't know the ball's in the box. She ought to be looking in the basket where she had left the ball. And by the time children are 4 or so, they are able to respond in this adult-like way and look for the ball in the basket. Now, that kind of study has generated an industry of tasks that investigate the way people um, uh, um, about people's theory of mind, about accessing an actor's or your interlocutor's thoughts about something, and it's led to like I said, a lot of very interesting, innovative, clever tasks, and then they put people on the scanner and see what areas become more activated when they do a theory of mind kind of task. And these are some of the names. Rebecca Sachs is somebody who's really developed the idea that the right TPJ, the right temporal parietal junction, is very critical for theory of mind, but also these other areas. So there's the left TPJ, the left temporal parietal junction, which is the mirror image of the right TPJ, the precuneus, and the medial prefrontal cortex. So these are the areas that have been highlighted by many people doing these studies, and then eventually someone like Frank van Overwald doing a meta-analysis and saying, well, these are the 4 areas that are typically implicated in theory of mind. And just to give you an idea of one sort of task that they use, imagine a study where you're lying in the scanner and you watch some videos of an actor walking into a room, picking up a box and putting it on a table. And you'll notice it says 3.5 seconds. That's there because that's how long it takes to come up with an image of the brain. And the question, the question that the subject is asked, or that you would be asked if you're in the scanner, is like, is the actor faking how heavy it is, or is the actor picking up the real amount of weight? And in order to create the films, the experimenter was, for the real condition, the experimenter was given the exact weight of the box that they were to pick up, or they were told to fake it, right? So the experimenter gives the actor the exact weight, but asks the actor to fake a different amount. And remarkably, whether participants were correct or not, the E stands for errors, there was heightened activity or more activity in the right temporal parietal junction. So again, this is just one example, right? So when people are trying to read into the actors' actions to see what their theory of mind might be, there's more activity there. And this is just one example. I was going to give more, but I didn't want to go on for too long. Okay, now let me get back to how this is relevant to our irony study. I mentioned that story before about the opera. Imagine that you have to read dozens of stories, and some of them are going to end up being having an ironic conclusion. Others will be more literal, but those are just a subset of all the stories you're going to be reading, because we don't want to give the game away. We want people to read these stories naturally. So here's that story written out as a stimulus item. Cynthia and Leah sing together in the same opera. On the night of the premiere, they meet at the theater. The show begins exactly on time. During their performance, both women sing off key. And after the show, Cynthia says to Leah, tonight we gave a superb performance. Then there's a follow-up line. And then there's a question just to make sure people are paying attention. Now take the same story. Notice that here's a critical line 4 where we say that both women sing off key. Now imagine we change that 4th line. So now it says both women sing beautifully and receive a rapturous round of applause. And now when you read tonight we gave a superb performance, it's sensible. It's what you might expect after having read this context. Let me point out as well that we also included stories that we call decoys, because we decided to use only ironies where something negative happened, singing off key, dropping a mirror, and we didn't want a negative event to be a cue that there's going to be an ironic remark coming up. So we came up with a bunch of decoys where something negative happens, but then someone makes a kind of banal statement. So here we have a story of Simon and Laure. This was actually done in French. All of these were done in French, so these are translations. Simon and Laure go to a tea salon. Laure asks Simon to choose a tea for her. He decides to order a black tea. The taste of the tea is very strong, and Law cannot finish her cup. And she tells Simon, I'm sorry, but this black tea is too strong for me. And again, we have, follow-up line and a question. Now, I should point out that there had been studies on irony when studies using fMRI started to become popular, I'd say, in the 90s. People were trying all sorts of interesting, trying to study interesting phenomena, and irony is a good one. But early on, I would say, or up, in the studies that preceded ours, you found heightened activity for ironic remarks kind of all over the place, with some overlap with areas that might be considered to be part of a theory of mind network. But to be honest, many of these studies weren't careful. So sometimes they would present just 2 lines. Sometimes they were mixed in with metaphors, because the idea was that a metaphor and irony are both examples of figurative language. This is just to show you that there was attempts made, but nobody had made the specific prediction that we did. And sure enough, when we did our study, we found heightened activity in those very 4 areas. It's called, this is a region of interest analysis, meaning that we were very conservative about where we would look to find activity, so that it's not just all over the place. And for each of those 4 areas, we find more activity when reading, when participants read a ironic, read a sentence that was meant to be ironic, as opposed to that very same sentence meant to be literal. And I should point out, of course, like I said earlier, there were dozens of these stories. Nobody got the same story twice. So if you read the story about the opera in an irony version, you wouldn't get it in the literal version. You get some other kind of study. Another condition. Well, let me just add some other details. Our main take-home message from at the time was that, verbal irony does prompt activation of well-known theory of mind-related regions, in contrast to the prior studies. But our point was that it shows that utterance comprehension can readily provoke theory of mind processing. And let me mention 2 other findings. One is that there's an integration between language and theory of mind networks. Working on the team with us was Jerome Prado, who's now a former student of mine, who's now known as an expert in fMRI and reasoning. And he used a clever technique to show that there was integration between language areas, the left inferior frontal gyrus, and especially the right TPJ and the medial prefrontal cortex. So that was one other feature of that study. And also I want to add that, the way, our view on the role of attitude description can explain the mixed results described earlier. In a later paper, we propose that attitude description actually plays a modulating role in irony comprehension. So, for example, if almost everybody who reads an irony early, reads an ironic utterance early in an experimental session, slows down, and that's almost universal. But over the course of the session, participants, especially socially inclined ones, and that we measured through what's called the autism quotient, people can practically anticipate the arrival of an irony. So if you remove the decoys, you'll get people catching on to the irony right away, or at least sooner over the course of the experimental session. So the role of attitude description, or having access to the speaker's theory of mind, is going to play a critical role in the way you understand irony. We could demonstrate that both neurologically and also through behavioral measures. Okay, let me turn to the next highly intensively studied area of experimental pragmatics, which I'll just refer to as scalars. You'll notice I'll avoid using the expression scalar implicature. In the very first page of Grice's posthumously published book. He had actually, people would studiously write out his lectures, and he was highly appreciated as while he was alive. But it was actually after he died that his book came out. The book that people referred to, and the very opening lines of it say this: there appear to be divergences in meaning between, on the one hand, at least some of what I call the formal devices, and here are logical expressions for not, and, or, if, then, all, and some, when they're given a standard two-valued interpretation, and on the other, what are taken to be their analogs or counterparts in natural language, such expressions as, well, the same thing, not, and, or, if, all, some, etc. And his point was that the way terms are appreciated in a logical proposition is not going to be necessarily the same as they're appreciated in everyday life. So to give the example of or, according to a logician, means P or Q, and perhaps both. Whereas in everyday language, it might mean that. But in other cases, if you ask somebody on the street the meaning of or, they might, I don't want to say everybody because it's not the case, but they'd be more likely to interpret or as being exclusive. If you open up a menu and you're told you could have pizza or a salad, it implies it's one or the other, but not both, just to give an example. So, and what's become known as scalar implicature, and it's, this is where I don't want to get into the weeds about this, but some people say, will emphasize that scalars are not necessarily implicatures, but they could become part of an implicature. So, but I'll just refer to it as a pragmatic enrichment when you go from, say, treating an or to mean A or B and perhaps both into A or B, but not both. There's a pragmatic step that you're applying there. But let me just tell you how a lot of this started, at least for me, and it kind of captures a transition I made from being a student of reasoning to a student of pragmatics. At the time I was interested in the way modals are understood. Modals are terms like might, and has to, or cannot, does not necessarily have to be, right? So, and I came up with a task where children and adults would see 3 boxes. And in 2 of those boxes, you would see what's inside, right? In one box, it would be a parrot and a bear. And in the other one, there was just a parrot. And then there's a 3rd box that remains covered. And you're told that, this is by the experimenter. All I know is that whatever is inside this box looks like what's inside this box or what's inside this box. And then all sorts of modal conclusions fall out. And the question is, to ask children and adults to evaluate these, through a truth evaluation task. And you'll say something like, well, there'll be a puppet, actually. You'll say there has to be a parrot in the box. Well, that's true because it follows that there has to be a parrot. To say there might be a bear, well, that's true because one of the boxes does have a bear and it might resemble that one, so it might be. You could say there cannot be a bear. That's false because there might be a bear. But the interesting case is this under-informative one, where you say there might be a parrot, right? Now, on the one hand, it's clearly true because there has to be a parrot. It follows that there might be a parrot. On the other hand, the choice of words to say there might be a parrot seems kind of under-informative. And that would justify you saying, the speaker said there might be a parrot. Well, that's not quite correct because there has to be a parrot. Now, interestingly, I did this with 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and adults. And the green line is this under-informative one. And interestingly, younger children tend to agree with it. They don't see a problem. They say there might be a parrot. Yeah, no problem. And at the same rate as the other control items. And here you see, and this is just the example from there has to be a parrot. But trust me when I say it's exemplary of all the other conditions. And even 7-year-olds continue to say, no problem, there might be a parrot. But as kids get older, they're less likely to accept that as true. And adults are least likely to accept that as true. So they're, ultimately, I would say that they're just being equivocal. Now, that was the introduction to this underinformative type of item, but one scalar term that's become the Drosophila of experimental pragmatics is the existential quantifier sum. And give you an idea of how that works with kids and adults. With Nausicaa Pusculus, who was a student with me and who's now at UCL in London, we came up with a task where people saw a bunch of animals. I just wrote out the words, but these were toy animals in and around boxes. And let me just point out that there were 2 dolphins outside of boxes, and there was a dolphin in each of 2 boxes. There was a hippo in one of the boxes. There were 2 elephants outside of the boxes. And you'll notice that there's a turtle in each of the 4 boxes. And what we did was, a lot of times we don't want to give the game away. We just asked a bunch of, we had 20 questions, and they're all pretty easy. Among them was this one underinformative one, but let me just show you some of the standard ones. If I say all the turtles in the boxes, that's true, no problem. If I say all the dolphins are in the boxes, well, that's false because dolphins are in some of the boxes. Everybody gets that right. Now, these are older children too. They were, I think, 8 to 10, if memory serves. But here's an interesting case where you say some turtles are in the boxes, and you'll notice that children generally agree with that. And adults are equivocal. So again, in this case, the general line of argument is that adults, or as you become older, you're more likely to appreciate that some invites you to consider that there's a distinction with all to be made, and you might say, well, some but not all turtles are in the boxes, and with that not all reading, you could then say false. Now, let me point out that this has become a highly replicated finding. You could manipulate these tasks so that you can make it easier or harder. Like I have did some in the same paper with Nausicaa. We looked at younger children, made the task much more user friendly. But you always find this pattern where younger children are more likely to accept what I'll call the logical meaning of these terms. And as only as you get older that you introduce more routinely, or not always, but more routinely, this pragmatic enrichment. And I'll describe to you in how you can view that. Just want to tell you that this led to a huge international planetary project that was led by Napoleon Katsos, who's now at Cambridge, under the cost project that was developed by Uli Sauerland, and we also had the help of Teresa Guasti and 50 other co-authors in a paper that came out in 2016, where we did the same sort of task, this time with 5-year-olds across 30 plus languages, 7 or so families of languages, and you find the same general pattern. And here, just to warn you, this is inverted. So these are rates of rejection, meaning adults reject a sentence like some of the boxes, some of the boxes have turtles. Some turtles are in the boxes. Though it was a different task. It was apples. And in any case, the question is, if you're given a situation where you see that it's the case that all of the X are Y, and you're told some of the X are Y, adults are much more likely to reject that statement than children, 5-year-olds. So how to view this? Well, the idea is that you can see that semantic readings are often good enough. Semantic readings come with, say, an at least type of reading with no upper bound. So you have the word some, it's compatible with all, and it often is good enough. You don't even have to consider whether you have to change it or modify it. But with age, and I'd argue with more available effort, enrichments from some to some but not all become more likely. So what's added pragmatically is an upper bound, right? So some gets narrowed from being compatible with all, from being cut off from all. So it has a narrowed reading. Okay, now we also, this was a nice discovery, and also was consistent with data that have been in the literature but not really discussed at all from a pragmatic point of view. And it's important to test theoretical claims. And for that, we had to turn to processing and with adults. And there's a prominent account that from Stephen Levinson that what are called general conversational implicatures, and Grice had considered a case like some to mean some but not all as a generalized conversational implicature, that these are default inferences. That is, these are inferences that are automatically generated and that can be canceled if there are contextual reasons for doing so. And so this led to a new set of studies, this time with Lewis Bott, who's a postdoc with me, who's now in Cardiff in Wales. We ran a set of experiments and we created statements that are under-informative by saying, say an exemplar, like some cows are mammals. Well, that's logically true. But if you have an enriched reading, some but not all cows are mammals, you're justified to say false. And then, of course, there are many control items. Like if you say all cows are mammals, well, that's true. To say some cows are insects, that's false. And this was designed to be random. So every, there was a set of items, cows and tree, maple, bees, all sorts of objects that you can use, and they were paired randomly so they could be in one of these conditions. So no two subjects saw the same set of data. Same set of stimuli. But what we were interested in was to see whether, see how people process this under-informative statement, and to determine whether through their reaction times, whether people are automatically treating some to mean some but not all, or perhaps the opposite. They're happy with the some and perhaps all reading, and then with extra effort, they understand it to mean some and not all. So these are the data. I'm going to show you quickly the control items. So if you say some cows are fruit, people get that right, around 90% of the time. But what was interesting is that for that under-informative item, you do get, this kind of bivocal type of response. Some people say true, some people say false, and people tend to be consistent over the course of the experiment. There were people that we called mixed, but for the most part, people were evenly split. So some people saying that some cows are mammals is true, and others saying false. But what was relevant for us was to see how much time it took them to process that. And what was interesting for us was that those, we called people who responded true as logical responders. Those who responded logically were as fast, were comparable to the other control conditions. Whereas those who had the some but not all reading took especially long. And we took that as a cue that to do a pragmatic inference was going to slow you down, that's extra effort that's going to be part of the task. And this addressed a debate that was going on in the theoretical literature, the armchair literature about pragmatics. There are people from relevance theory who would say, well, scalar inferences are derived when contextually supported. You don't need them necessarily each and every time you come across the word some, for example. The semantic reading is often good enough. Whereas the default accounts would say scalar implicatures, they're generalized conversational implicatures, and they're default inferences that are automatically generated each and every time. But I think our data addressed that because if they weren't, if indeed a some but not all reading was automatic, you would see that those who were logical would take longer because you would have to cancel them in order to say true. So the empirical literature has produced several signature effects concerning scalar terms like some, like some to be understood as some but not all. And generally, it's been shown that they are costly to generate based on the following sorts of findings. Well, children, as I showed you, enrich less frequently than adults. Enriched readings are not produced systematically among adults. Contexts that encourage enriched readings are linked with longer reading times. Very nice work. Also very nice work is on eye tracking studies that show that when you use the word some, it doesn't immediately favor a not all reading. This is based on these studies where you have to track or decide which girl out of two is consistent with a sentence like, click on the girl that has some of the socks. So I won't get into it, but it's a really nice paradigm. And also dual tasks where people like Wim Denis and Walter Skaken gave people an extra load, an extra memory load, while they had to do a standard Scalar task. And those who had to keep in mind, say, a complex set of dots were more likely to keep what I'll call logical reading. And if you had a lighter cognitive load, you'd be more likely to make the pragmatic inference. So all these things point to the idea that it's going to take some amount of effort to produce this pragmatic inference. And the way scalars are processed continues to fascinate the literature. There are those who want to claim that scalar enrichments are linked to grammatical principles and not pragmatics, and that comes from Gennaro Cerchia and colleagues, and that's led to debate and lots of data. And also more recently, well, it's been around for a while, but I'd say what's been the talk of the town lately has been the way modeling could capture scalars. So, the Rational Speech Act model from Frank and Goodman sets up, they have a model that tries to explain a lot of the kinds of data that you find in the literature, and it assumes that speakers and listeners reason about likely interpretations while considering the literal reading of an utterance and the pragmatic one. And it's not, the role of scalars in that work is kind of the tip of the spear, because they want to use the RSA to explain all sorts of pragmatic phenomena. But today's talk is about intentions, and I want to turn to intentions in scalar inference research, because among the people who have addressed scalars, there are those who whose data undermine the claim that enriched readings are slower or effortful, and that's by investigating politeness scenarios. And here I'm referring to work from Jean-François Bonfont and colleagues, including Aidan Feeney and Gaël Villejoubert. They argue that in certain kinds of situations, let's say face-threatening situations, people just don't produce the scalar inference. So let me give you an example. Imagine you're invited to your in-laws for the first time, and you have a good time. You thought you had a good time. Everybody had a good time. And you ask your significant other, what impression did I make during dinner? And your significant other says, well, some thought that you drank too much. Now, according to their account, the sum is compatible with all, and it probably means all. So that means that you didn't make the inference. The idea being, their hypothesis being that scalar inferences are less likely to be derived when the scalar utterance is face-threatening, right? So your significant other is being polite and not saying the full thrust of what is meant. And how did they go about studying this? Well, they came up, with these vignettes, much like we use in irony. I mean, it's, everybody uses these. Imagine you gave a speech at a small political rally. You were discussing your speech with Denise, who was in the audience, and there were 6 other people in the audience, and you were considering whether to give the same speech to another audience. Hearing this, Denise tells you that some people loved your speech. Well, this is a case where there's no face threat. So that if you're given the question, given what Denise tells you, do you think it's possible that everybody loved your speech? Well, you're likely to say no, because there you do have some. She could have said everybody loved your speech, but you didn't. So in this case, you'll be convinced that probably some, but not all people loved your speech. Okay, now let's change the love to hated. Same situation, you gave your speech, and you asked Denise what she thought, and she said some people hated your speech. And this is a situation just like the one I described just before about drinking too much. Some people thought you drink too much. Now, when people, if you're a subject in this study and someone says, you're asked, given what Denise tells you, do you think it's possible that everybody hated your speech? It's more mixed, right? So more people will be likely to say, yes to this, right? Fewer people will say no. And this is what the data look like. So you see that when face boosting, some people loved your speech. People are likely to come up with a narrow reading. This is based on how you answer that, what we call in our lab, the semantic compatibility question. And you'll have fewer of those in the face threatening context. To put it another way, people will say no to, does this mean all? In the face boosting context, it's 17%, but it goes up in that face threatening. So where some is more likely to be made compatible with all. So according to Bonfont and et al., scalar inferences are less likely to be derived when the scalar utterance is face threatening. Individuals are likely to construe the quantifier sum as a polite device meant not to hurt the feelings of the listener. So here you're really getting at intentions, right? What is it the speaker is trying to, what's the informative intention of the speaker when they use sum? They followed up to study with a very similar study, this time in Dutch, I think, and they also kept reaction times, where those two pieces of the presentation were presented and timed, right? So you got those two together, and they registered how long it took for someone to answer. And what they found was, the same kind of results. More people are more likely to say a narrow reading, a not all reading for face boost than for face threat. And when you're in the face threat condition, the percentage of broad responses, right? The complement of this 45% leads to longer reaction times, right? So according to them, not only are people more likely to have a broad reading of some to mean some and let's say all, but it's going to take them longer. So those are two strikes against the accepted wisdom about the way pragmatic enrichments work. Not only does pragmatic enrichment not faster, it's the semantic reading that's sorry, it's not that the pragmatic reading is slower, it's the semantic reading that's slower. Well, when Diana Mazzarella came to work with me as a postdoc, she presented an alternative account. One, honestly, that I didn't see myself. She argued that it's not that addressees derive the scalar inference, not all X, as part of the communicated content. It's just that they don't accept it as true. They get it. They get that the polite device is to say some, but not all. But there's another step, because people, addressees are not only just taking up what is expressed, they're also evaluating it for whether it's true or false, or whether they believe it or not. This is part of a program of research known as epistemic vigilance that was introduced by Dan Sperber and his colleagues. So she wrote, it's not inherently a question about the speaker's informative intention. It's not about the interpretation of the scalar utterance that matters. When here she was speaking about the Bonfont et al. Data. It's going to be about whether they believe that expressed, communicated piece of information. And she also pointed out to me, and again, this is something I didn't notice myself, and I had reviewed that paper that I advised to be accepted because I couldn't see anything wrong with it. She pointed out that the reading times are based on the combination of two sentences, right? So it's not that they measured how people treated this line of the task. They measured how people reacted to these two lines, right? To the scalar utterance plus to what we call the semantic compatibility question. And so she said, if we break those up, we get a better idea of how people are treating the scalar utterance versus the semantic compatibility question. So we basically ran the same study as they did, but we broke up those two parts so that people, what people have to do, and this was done, over the internet online. We had people read the same kinds of stories, but after they read, some people hated your speech or loved your speech, they had to hit the space bar to continue. And so what you have here on top is the, when you combine the scalar utterance plus the semantic compatibility question, and you get the same kind of effect that they reported. In our data, we couldn't get an interaction, that was statistically significant, but we still have the same tendency as they did. And you'll notice that for this case, there's nothing particular about the way this line is treated. In fact, it's among, it seems about average compared to the other conditions. But you do see that there's a slowdown relative to the other conditions here. So it's when they're doing the semantic compatibility question that you notice that there's some slowdown. Again, we didn't report a significant result here, but it was in line with what they had reported. And in fact, when I went back to Bonfont et al.'s reaction time study, I noticed that they were making the claim that people are slowing down again when they were combining both the scalar utterance and the semantic compatibility question. That the slower the people were, the more likely they were to have a broad interpretation. So people who reacted quickly held on to what they called a narrow interpretation, of some but not all reading in that face threat condition, and those who took longer were more likely to disbelieve, according to our point of view, what was being transmitted. So according to Diana et al., and that includes me, the increasingly longer response times associated with semantic readings reflect the effort of disbelieving the speaker's informative intention in the face threat condition. So this is work that Diana has developed. Diana is now at Neuchâtel in Switzerland as a professor. And this is kind of gives you a flavor of what she's been working on. Now, we focus often on experiments. When I thought about the role of intentions and scalars, I couldn't help but think about how you don't have to necessarily look at experiments to appreciate the role of intentions with respect to utterances. Just look at public discourse. For when activists first asserted Black Lives Matter, they were protesting for fairer treatment of Black Americans by police and justice departments. The movement took hold after George Zimmerman was found not guilty in the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2013. And what's the informative intention of their slogan, Black Lives Matter? It's that, well, stop treating us as if we don't matter. Now, when an adopted counter-reaction slogan is all lives matter, it's attributing to the Black Lives Matter slogan, as well as to its activists, a scalar reading, as if they're saying only Black Lives Matter. And to appreciate how absurd that actually is, imagine if it was, the interpretation was Black lives and no other lives matter. That's far from what they have in mind. So, this counter slogan is a move to reinterpret the Black Lives Matter slogan. It's to give the slogan and its movement a meaning that was never intended. It was never considered. So, of course, here we don't have a word some in there. And, to appreciate the role of scalar inference or pragmatic enrichment, I should say, you could see that it applies more generally. And it's been, the counter reaction slogan, all lives matter, I think disingenuously is attributing an informative intention that was never there to start with. And that holds for other counter reactions that refuse to or fail to accept the informative intention of that original phrase. Okay. So far, I've shown how intentions figure into irony processing and in seemingly under-informative scalar utterances, both of which are extra-sententials. That means that when Grice presented his theory, the argument is that you have to consider an entire utterance before you start doing pragmatic work on it. Now, can pragmatic processes be a component of a word? In other words, can they be part of a word's conventional meaning? Is there added pragmatic value in a particular word? And I want to briefly present ongoing work that looks at particular expression in European French French that in our view shows that pragmatic processes can become a part of a word's meaning, at least among 6-year-olds and adults. And this is work that I'm currently doing with Druzy Turco, who's a new colleague in Paris, Nicolas Petit, who's a PhD student of mine, and Ye Tian, who's now a research scientist in Cambridge at Mediatek. I've always been fascinated by the French way, the French response C. I mean, you could tell that I've used my experiences learning French to appreciate pragmatic features of language. And one of the unique features of European French that we don't have in English, but it's still something that you could find in many, but not all languages, is that there's a particular disambiguating way to answer false negative questions, such as if someone said to me, are you not American? I would say yes, or yes, I am. If this were posed to me in French, vous n'êtes pas américain, I would say si. And si, and here are other examples of other languages that have this kind of what's called a contrapositive response. Si has a particular feature that it addresses two features of a negative question in one stroke. On the one hand, it's disagreeing with the reading of the statement surface structure, right? So if you turn vous n'êtes pas américain, you're not American, it's disagreeing with that literal phrase. At the same time, it's answering affirmatively to what could be viewed as the inferable positive belief. The questioner must have imagined that I am American, but then doubted it. And so the answer is saying yes to that inferable positive belief that might be maybe part of his prior intention. Now, to return to Grice's saying meaning distinction, he, as part of his program, he made a distinction between conversational implicatures, which are clearly extra-linguistic, and conventional implicatures, which are cases which have further pragmatic meaning, but they're captured conventionally in a language. And so, the example I gave at the top was about, Bill is a philosopher and he's therefore brave. The one I like to work with is, if I say George Clooney is famous, but he is nice, you have, again, two parts of a conjunction, right? You have George Clooney is famous, George Clooney is nice, but when you join it with but, you're making a contrast between these two, right? So I could have said George Clooney is famous and he is nice, but by adding but, I'm revealing that there's a contrast to be made between him being famous and his being nice. So maybe typically famous people are not nice. By me asserting that he is nice, I'm saying that there's a contrast to be made between the two conjuncts. Now, we wanted to set up a study that makes predictions about the speed with which adult participants respond in French to negative questions that call for this response C. And we're going to also have cases where you just say oui or no. And the most fundamental trials of this scenario will present cases in which a participant is presented information about a candy that can be found in one of two boxes. And we started with adults and 6-year-olds because sorry, I said adult participants. We're also interested in children because we're expecting a developmental effect. But let me just present to you the paradigm. So imagine, you're a subject, you're the person here in green, and you're facing a screen. The screen is turnable. So behind that screen is a experimenter who has got a keyboard and could control the way this experiment is going to be unrolled. So the subject sees this puppet kind of sitting in a room and in front of two boxes, one white and one red. And the game is to find a candy that is in one of those two. It's in one or the other, but not, it's an exclusive disjunction, right? So the puppet starts off by making a claim that it's surely in the box or it's surely not in the box, or she'll say, I don't know where it is. And I can't get into why we did that, but it's an important step. And at that point, the participant sees the box kind of slide off the screen, and this is where the experimenter intervenes and puts out a white box to make it seem like it's a continuation of what was on the screen comes into real life. And at that point, the participant opens the box, and in this case, discovers that there is the candy inside, and the participant closes the box and gets ready to hear a question. And here, a question could be affirmative or negative. So the affirmative question is, it is in the white box, to which you'd expect the participant to say oui in French. And if you get a negative question, it's not in the white box. We've had the recordings say it in such a way that it's in the white box. So there is a question, but it's closer to being a statement. This is fine in French. And so if you get a negative question, it's not in the white box. The participant is in the situation to say si. Now you could do the same thing where instead of the box being having the candy, the box comes out and it's empty, and then you get it is in the white box, and you have to say no. If you get it, it's not in the white box, you would say no. So these are the four conditions. We refer to them as AO for affirmation, and you say oui, negative, and you say si, affirmation, and you would say no, and negative, and you say no. So those are the four conditions. Now, our predictions were that given the added pragmatic value of C, it would be the most challenging to produce. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that, especially compared to the other conditions. And we counted on these signature pragmatic effects that I described earlier, where we would assume that if there's a pragmatic inference, it prompts slowdowns relative to other conditions, and that you should see more pragmatic processing increasing with age. And we pre-registered these predictions. So among adults, we said that C, the NS condition, the negative C condition, would take longer to articulate than the other three. And younger children, we wanted to be conservative about how this expresses itself, but we just said we would see non-adult behavior with respect to C among younger children. And how do we measure these articulation times? Well, we developed what we called the response reaction time, which was, after this very natural exchange between the puppet and the participant, we took all the recordings and we had our lab assistants go through them and measure how much time it took from the moment we knew which, the subject knew what box was being described, because, when you're getting this question, given all the filler, I didn't describe all the filler items, but there were 40 items altogether and just 24 experimental items. But you could very well get a question about the red box, even though it's on the screen. So both boxes remained in play as you were going through this trial. And so it's only when you get a sentence like il est dans la boîte blanche or il n'est pas dans la boîte blanche that you know that that you're talking about that box. And so that's a moment that disambiguates which box you're talking about. And that's going to be the beginning of our RRT, the response reaction time. And we record how long it takes for the participant to start articulating their response. In this case, this is an example of C. But of course, we did the same thing with we and no. And what we found was that adults and 6-year-olds produced very similar outcomes, except that kids were generally slower. And what do I mean that they were similar? The NS condition was indeed the slowest, as we had hoped, as we predicted. And you can see that the affirmation question where you say we was the fastest, but the patterns that you see here was very similar for adults and for 6-year-olds, except the 6-year-olds were typically, higher up and the adults were lower down. Okay, now these sort of expectations were surprising. These predictions are surprising because, when, given how long I've been around, my references are often to older literature, and, some classic studies from the 70s and 80s would tell you that for a false negative statement, it should be actually faster than a true negative, right? So this is the equivalent of a NS, and this is the equivalent of an NN. So like in this example from Clark and Chase, and I think this is from 71, if you're presented this kind of presentation, an A above a B, and you're told A is above B, you should say true. Now the options were only true or false. If you're told B is above A, you should say false. And if you introduce a negation, A isn't above B, it ought to slow you down according to the model behind Clark and Chase's classical data. It should slow you down a bit more, and putting this into getting a true response should take you longest overall. And when you compare that to our data, they look, you can notice how actually we didn't even provide options. People naturally responded C, and they took longest to do that, which implies that there's some extra effort, extra work going on when you answer C. And there's other data, this one from Justin Carpenter, where they're given this presentation, the dots are red, and you have, you could say the dots are red, that's true. The dots are black, that's false. The dots are not red, that's conditioned that in French, you'd be entitled to say C. And again, you get, this nice progression, and these models predict that. But, in French, if you ask people to naturally say yes, no, or C, you get this C response taking longer for that false negation. Okay, so these are the first results to indicate that C requires extra effort, but we found no developmental effects. So we sought even younger children. We did the same task with 4-year-olds. And again, we predicted that, the younger you go, you should get less adult-like, you should see something about the way younger kids answer C. And in fact, what we found was remarkable because, well, first let me just show you the control items. If you compare, these are 4-year-olds and these are the 6-year-olds. If you compare the negation no condition, they're similar. The affirmative no condition, they're similar. The they're similar. But when it comes to the negated and then negation saying C, as I've been pointing out, it's very, it's slowest for the 6-year-olds and the adults, but it's fastest for the 4-year-olds. So what's going on here? Well, I'll get to that. As I summarize these results, the C response enjoins pragmatic processes. I think that's what we've made clear. Adults and 6-year-olds reveal that effortful pragmatic inference making arises when C is called for, indicating that a pragmatic procedure is actually a component of its meaning, at least for 6-year-olds and adults. The C is prompting a clarifying informative intention. This, it's a procedure. According to relevance theory, this would be considered procedural meaning, and it's indicating that the literal read on the question is wrong, but the implicit affirmative is indeed right. So this two-pronged answer is surgically modifying the questioner's epistemic state. Now, getting back to the 4-year-olds, what's going on with them? Well, we argue that the fast C response indicates that the C does not appear to incorporate a pragmatic procedure for them. And in fact, you could say that there's a semantic representation for C, and there are two papers from semanticists that account for actually all response particles. That semanticists are concerned not only with C in particular, but with answering particles, yes, no, etc. overall. And according to their account, C is something exceptional, and it only goes so far semantically as to recognize disharmony between what is literally said in the question and the facts of the matter. And so, according to our account, this pragmatic process is evolving in children as they get older, so that there's a pragmatic component of C that evolves with age. And this, semantic come pragmatic reading of C with age makes it compatible with many developmental pragmatic phenomena, that I described earlier. So we're very excited about those results. Okay, now let me conclude, and I hope I haven't been too long. At the core of Gricean pragmatic theory making is intention reading. I hope that's become clear. And when intentions are carefully considered, whether they're attitudes that accompany an utterance, epistemic evaluations of utterances, epistemic beliefs that are corrected by an answerer, experimental results can be edifying for semantic and pragmatic theories. I'm also hoping that I've made clear that pragmatic inferencing is ubiquitous. It's part of every, if you're a radical pragmatist like myself, it's part of every utterance that you have to do some kind of pragmatic inference making. And, what I left kind of implicit is that our experiments or experimental pragmatics is critical to advancing linguistic pragmatic theory making. And with that, I'll say thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Noveck, and thank you for this great presentation on the role of intentions in utterance comprehension, and also on all your new discoveries in developmental pragmatics. I have a couple of questions here addressed by the audience. So I chose the two I thought were most relevant. So the first one is, considering that autistic children often present delay in language development, can we assume that intention reading or pragmatic competence in general is essential for first language acquisition?
Well, the question about people on the spectrum is an interesting one, because it has been one of the topics covered by people interested in experimental pragmatics. Because early on, the idea of, there used to be a kind of simplistic account, which was that people on the spectrum are just missing theory of mind. And if that were the case, then you should find that people on the spectrum are not ready to do all sorts of pragmatic inferences. And that's what set in motion a bunch of people, including Coralie Chevalier, who worked with me, who was a student in my lab, and worked with Deirdre Wilson and Francesca Happe, started to put together a series of tasks to see whether people who are on the spectrum behave any differently when doing, say, a scalar task, or in the case of other folks in Holland did work on conditionals to see whether there's any kind of difference between people who are ASD versus not. And in fact, the result was negative, that there was no difference. And so, that was one of the pieces that told people that, to generalize this notion of theory of mind as being critical or critically missing among people on the spectrum is just grossly wrong. At the same time, everybody recognizes that there's something, including people on the spectrum themselves. I follow people on Twitter and elsewhere, and they describe how difficult it is to actually appreciate, they point out how sometimes it's difficult to, fully appreciate the informative intention, if you will, of other people. But they can do it. In fact, Deirdre described a blog that she saw where someone on the spectrum said, "Oh, it's easy to do irony. You just have to, make a face and say the opposite of what you're thinking." So that there might be kind of mechanical way of dealing with it, but they recognize that there's something difficult, and actually irony is one of those examples that they have a particular difficulty with. So there's something. But using pragmatics kind of grossly is not going to answer the question. Actually, I don't remember the question exactly, but I started thinking about it was about language acquisition in general.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, assuming that it has, there have been new theories. So Coralie has her own theory about what is difficult for people on the spectrum in language. It's an ongoing debate about where to place the role of pragmatics in language difficulty, but I don't think it's been resolved yet. But it's clearly not an absence of theory of mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know if I answered the question, but
I guess so. The next question has also to do with cognitive impairment. And the question is, does your research address studies with subjects who have Alzheimer's disease?
None of my studies have done that. I once did a study with scalars among people who have epileptic seizures, and found some differences, but it wasn't clean, so I never published it. And there, there was a similar effect where, when people were being treated for their seizures, they were more likely to produce a scalar inference as I expect. But the data weren't, categorically clear. And also, one kind of effect that we often find is, a lot of the adults in these tasks are people who are, they're college freshmen, or, so they kind of know the game. They read a text and they say, oh, I see what you're trying to do. And they'll process things more deeply. And, if you do the same kinds of studies with people who are unaware of, the whole experimental psychology game, they'll, on the one hand, they give more honest responses, but you'll get less predictable answers. So so that was another feature of that study where I couldn't control for, didn't have enough people so I could control for say educational level. About that particular case, Alzheimer's, I think somebody's done work on it. I wish I could just pull it out of my head, but it would be a natural thing to look at. But no, I'm not aware. I can't deliver that, but I'll look it up. And if that person wants to contact me, I'll try my best to answer that question later on.
Okay, that person is me.
Oh.
Okay, so considering that we have been more than an hour and a half now, so I think we can come up to the end of the session, yes. And I would like you to thank you very much once more for your intriguing presentation on this new perspective. And I learned a lot about experimental pragmatics, and I'm sure everybody who attended the talk also did. So as a researcher, I would like to ask you again to please deliver more talks on this topic. It's very interesting. And I'd like also to thank Miguel for organizing, our Abralim president. And I would like also to invite all people attending to join Abralim and to attend our next sessions. And again, thank you very, very much once more, Dr. Noveck, for your time and for your very interesting talk.
Well, thank you.
Hope to see you soon again.
I hope to see you soon, and physically.
Yeah, we all hope to see everybody physically in the near future.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.